Sometimes you have to cross that bridge when you come to it. Oh, that was stupid. Yes. Did I? Oh. Probably not tall enough for me to hold my breath. So I'm sure glad to see you. I've been gone for a little bit. 2 weeks feels like eternity. So, but I'm glad to be back. So tonight we're going to get back into talking about the fate of the apostles. Tonight, as you can see, we're probably going to talk about the martyrdom of Thomas. Thomas was mentioned only in the listing of the 12 in the Synoptic Gospels. So if you remember, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they are the Synoptic Gospels, basically a synopsis of Jesus' ministry. John's a little different. John lists Thomas 3 times. Who wants to tell us what Thomas' nickname has been forever? Doubting Thomas. Not sure exactly why they got there, but somebody determined that since he said what he said about not believing until he actually saw Jesus physically, he should be called Doubting Thomas. So John mentions him 3 times in his gospel. The first time he talks about Thomas is when Jesus learns about Lazarus being sick. And they're asking Jesus to come because Lazarus is sick and he wants to see his friend and he may not make it. And all the disciples try to dissuade Jesus from going. And seeing that they can't dissuade him, Thomas finally says, well, we all go so we can all die also. Kind of a cynical Thomas. That's in John chapter 11, verse 16. Some say that this proves how brave Thomas was, that he was willing to go and die with Jesus. And that's possibly it, but I kind of wonder if it wasn't that more cynical thing. Yeah, let's go. We're all going to die. Oh, yeah, okay. If that's what you want to do, let's all go and die with him. The second time that John talks about Thomas, he mentions him when Jesus is telling his disciples that I'm going away. You know where I'm going, he says. You know the way, but you can't come now. But you know the way and you know all these things. And finally, Thomas says, how do we know the way? How do we know these things? This is in John chapter 20. I'm sorry. This is in John chapter 14. Jesus, how do we know these things, he says to him. My wife is always asking me questions. And she abandoned me tonight, just so you know, for grandkids and the fair. So she said, will it be too bad if I don't go with you Wednesday night? I said, no, I'll just feel terribly alone and abandoned, but hey, it's okay. And she said, okay, I'm going. So, but anyway, she asks me these questions all the time, and sometimes I look at her and I say, how on earth do you expect me to know the answer to that question? And this is kind of what Thomas seems to be doing to Jesus. Wait a minute. You're telling us you're going away, and we can't go with you, but we know the way? How on earth are we supposed to know that? Usually when I say that to Miss Kathy, she says something sarcastic like, well, I thought you knew everything. I wonder if Jesus felt like saying that to Thomas. But that's when Jesus tells them, I am the light, the truth, and the way. The third time that John mentions Thomas in the book of John is in John chapter 20. Somewhere in here, I'm confused. I think I've got it written confused. But where he says to the other apostles when they say, we've seen Jesus. He was here. He rose from the dead. He was here with us. And he says to them, I will never believe it unless I'm able to see the scars in his hand and feel the scar in his side and see him in the flesh. And some say that John writes this down to show that Jesus came that specific time, 8 days later, for nothing more than to show Thomas, hey, here I am. And that some believe that he specifically came just to show Thomas and to help Thomas to believe. What's the last thing he says to Thomas? We'll go over this a little more, but he says to him, Thomas, blessed are those who have not seen, yet still believe. One of the things you hear a lot about this time of year, especially around Easter, is some of the words that Jesus said on the cross. When Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some people, I've heard all kinds of sermons about it. Some people say, oh, God at that moment had to turn his back on Jesus because God can't look on sin. And I think that's not the mentality of a father toward his child. In reality, what's happening there, and what most scholars believe is true, is in that day and time, if you had a student and you wanted to teach them something, they would teach them the Psalms. And good Jewish boys, good Jewish young men knew the Psalms. And so most people know that when Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was quoting the first part of Psalm 22 that speaks of and prophesies Jesus being on that cross and dying. But the last part of, if you read Psalm 22, it's a dark psalm. Remember, song. Psalms are the songbook of the Bible. And most of these people knew these psalms because they had sung them. If I started out and said, beloved, let us love one another. If I sang it, beloved, let us love one another. Most of you know it. You know that verse. Yep, you can stop singing now. It's quite all right. We get it. But that's the point. Most of you know that song because you've sang it. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loves is born of God and knows God. He that does not love does not know God, for God is love. 1 John 4, 7 and 8, right? That's how it goes. We know it because we sing it. Why do we sing it? I was sitting in a restaurant, waiting to go into a restaurant in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and a kid walks by and he's singing ABC. And I thought, who doesn't know the finish of that song? Maybe someone younger than him, but we all know it. That's how we teach them, by singing that. That's how the apostles were taught. That's how the Jewish people were taught, by songs. People all over the world are taught their history through songs and various things of that nature. So when Jesus cried that out, he's quoting Psalm 22. I go to this great length to tell you that because while the first part and the second part of Psalm looks pretty dark, just like almost every other psalm, the last part of it says, but you, God. The last part of it says that all will come to know you, God. It insinuates that because of this, they'll all know you, Lord. They'll all believe. They're going to come to know you through this thing that's going on right now. And what Jesus was trying to say to Thomas, and what he was saying from the cross is, look, you already know these things. Bring them to your mind. who, when Jesus says, if you turn to John, let's turn to John chapter 14. Begin verse 1. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And where I go, you know, and the way you know. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going, and how can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. And from now on, you know him and have seen him. When Jesus says to us, okay, what are you going to do? Times look rough. It's pretty dark. What are you going to do? Jesus, I don't know how we're going to make it. I am the light, the truth, and the way. Jesus, my heart is broken. I don't know how I'm going to make it without this loved one. I am the light, the truth, and the way. But he says to Thomas, if you had known me. Now, we're pretty sure that Jesus is telling his disciples this near the end of his ministry. How long do you have to be with someone to know them? These disciples had been with them at least or close to 3 years. They lived with him. They ate with him. Wherever he went, they went with him. They saw the miracles. They saw the things that had happened, and yet they still did not know him. And Jesus said, if you had known me, you wouldn't have to ask that question. Lord, how are we going to make it? If you know me, you won't have to ask that question. Lord, what's going to happen? You see this country is going to hell in a handbasket. Said that word here in church. But there is a real place, right? And this world is going there, Lord, in a handbasket. It's going quickly. If you had known me, you don't have to ask that question. But this was Thomas. This was God answering Thomas. You see, Jesus not only knew that his disciples were a bit dull and still didn't get it, he knows that we are a bit dull and still don't get it. I get afraid. I lose sleep at night sometimes thinking about things. There are things that I used to worry about that I don't worry about anymore. And you'd think I'd learn that those things didn't happen, and so I can trust God. You'd think I would learn from that. You think I would know him. That's what Jesus is trying to say. If you knew me, if you know me, you know the Father. And see, we believe what we haven't seen. We've heard it. Thomas saw it, touched it, and felt it. Blessed are you if you can believe without seeing. And that's what Jesus was trying to say. He's talking about you and me. So, Thomas. There's not much said about Thomas after the Gospel of John. Again, he's listed among the 12, and that's about it. Just like a lot of the apostles, there's not much more said about him. There's not much said about him in Acts. Many of the early church fathers, many of the early church traditions, though, have Thomas going to the country of India and ministering and evangelizing in the country of India, and died there about 72 A.D. Just like every other apostle, there's a whole bunch of different stories. It's interesting that more extra biblical books have been written about Thomas than about any other apostle. Let me read you something that Sean McDowell from the book Fate of the Apostles that we've been studying from wrote. This is, quote, "Along with playing a significant role in the Gospel of John, Thomas went on to become a prominent figure in the Gnostic and apocryphal texts of the early church. Thomas is a central figure in the infancy Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas, the infancy Gospel of Thomas was written about AD 140 to 170. The Gospel of Thomas about AD 150. The Book of Thomas, the Contender, about AD 140 to 170. The Acts of Thomas, about AD 200 to 220. And the Apocalypse of Thomas was written in the 6th century. Thomas' prominent appearance in the apocryphal tradition is noteworthy. Thomas was such a significant figure in the early church that some suggested there was a Thomas school with some degree of organization that may have produced some of the early Gnostic texts that feature Thomas. And remember, we've talked about these Gnostic writings. Remember, Gnostic or Gnosis, Greek for knowledge. And in this case, typically some secret knowledge about Jesus, and typically about him being different than who we think he is. That he really wasn't God, and that he really didn't die. And so these Gospels, or these Acts of the Apostles, or these other books, these Gnostic writings, were set down to try to prove these points. They mostly began around the year 200, though there were some earlier writings. Those earlier writings were taken and moved over and expanded on into these Gnostic writings. So when the infancy Gospel of Thomas was written in about 140 to 170 AD, remember, that's still in that time frame of personal knowledge, where they would have known people who knew Thomas, or known people who were taught by people who knew Thomas, and were still in that time frame. So some of the legends in these books, though they are legends, if you remove some of the legendary stuff from them, you can get to a kernel of the truth. So for instance, martyrdom of Thomas, based on the Acts of Thomas, remember again, written in about 200 to 220 AD. So the story goes that the apostles were casting lots to see who would go where. Remember, Jesus said, go to the world, take the gospel to the ends of the earth, right? So the story goes, and this is a story, right? The story goes that the apostles were casting lots to figure out who would go to what country. The lot for India fell on Thomas, but Thomas refused to go. This is according to the writing, the Gospel of Thomas, or excuse me, the Acts of Thomas. Thomas refused to go. Later on, Jesus came to him and began to talk to him about these things. About that time, a traveler from India got off a ship and was looking for a carpenter to come back to India with him to build a castle for King Gandhar. So Jesus offered to, this is how the story goes, I keep saying this is not the gospel, this is how it's told. So Jesus offers to sell Thomas into slavery so that he will go and build this house. Thomas agrees, goes to India, which at that time, getting away from the story, there were quite a few trading ships going back and forth from Rome to India and from other places within the known world. So Thomas gets on a boat, goes over to India. King Gandhar gives him money to build him a castle outside the city walls. And instead of building the castle, Thomas spends the money on the poor. Very angry, King Gandhar throws him into prison and is deciding what torture he will do to him. That night, King Gandhar's brother Gad dies, goes to heaven, sees the mansion that Thomas has built there and is allowed to come back, and the next day is back to life and tells his brother, King Gondofor, what great things happened with his money. So they all believe in Thomas, and a whole bunch of people get saved. Okay? Then Thomas goes to another part of India and ministers, and another king gets angry at him and then has him murdered by spearing. Okay? That's the story. You see a lot of legend in that, right? There are other parts of that story that talk about Thomas and Bartholomew traveling and a wild cat coming out of the woods and bowing down to them and repenting and this kind of stuff. So it gets pretty fanciful and pretty crazy quickly. But historians know that even though you have these crazy legends built in this thing, there is still that part of truth. There's a lot of evidence that says Thomas was indeed in India. I'll read you another one. This comes, the problem with the history of India is that they never had a written history until about the 16th century. So all of their history was oral history. All of it through stories that they told their children, a lot like the Hebrews did. This is how they taught. But they didn't actually have it written down till about the 16th century. But listen to this. This comes from the St. Thomas Christian Encyclopedia of India. In fact, they call many of these Christians St. Thomas Christians. But it says, quote, according to Indian tradition, St. Thomas came by sea and first landed at Cranganore about the year 52 A.D., converted high-caste Hindu families in Cranganore, Palayor, Quilin, and some other places, visited the Coromandel coast, making conversions, crossed over to China and preached the gospel, returned to India and organized the Christians of Malabar under some guides or priests from among the leading families he had converted and erected a few public places of worship. Then he moved to Coromandel and suffered martyrdom on or near Little Mount. His body was brought to the town of Milapore and was buried in a holy shrine he had built. Christians, goes the tradition, from Malabar, Near East, and even from China, used to go on pilgrimage to Milapore and venerate the tomb. So you see the difference in the two stories. One is very fanciful. One adds all these other things to it. The other is kind of matter of fact. And you can see there are some things that are pretty standard in there. One, Thomas went to India. Two, Thomas died in India. And it is believed that he didn't just die, he was murdered or martyred. He was killed for his faith. Here's a few other things you should hear. Scoffers don't believe these stories about India because the written history didn't happen until the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century. However, it should be noted that just because India had no written history does not mean there was no record of historical events. Much like the Hebrews, Indians used stories and memorization to pass down their history. But there is further evidence of Thomas's missionary trips to India. Pantanaeus, the Egyptian Christian scholar, was sent to India to preach the gospel in AD 189. He found a thriving Christian church there that claimed the Apostle Thomas as their founder. Actually, they also claimed Bartholomew as their founder. And when he got there, they had a copy of Matthew's gospel. They didn't even realize this. He found in 189 AD, he found a thriving Christian church there that claimed the Apostle Thomas as their founder. In the late 4th to early 5th century, the Roman Emperor Constantius sent Theophilus the Indian as ambassador to Yemen in hopes of getting permission to build churches for locals as well as Roman travelers. In India, he discovered resident congregants regular church services where the gospel was read in Syriac, a ministering clergy, and uniquely Indian customs such as listening to the gospel in a sitting posture. This is an unmistakably Indian form of listening. This is in the 300s, in the 4th century that this happened. Excuse me, the 5th century. So what they're telling us is that they're, by going there and discovering this, then there's quite a bit of proof that what the Indians claim, that Thomas was their patron saint, that Thomas did come there and preach the gospel to them and died there in AD 72 is fairly well provable. And so we can believe with a great deal of confidence that Thomas, the apostle, was martyred in India in AD 72. Got it? Good? Any questions? Where's those Rangers? I hurried to get done before they got here. So let's recap where we are then. So we've talked about Peter. What happened to Peter? Peter crucified. Definitely crucified in Rome under Nero in about AD 52 or 54, somewhere in there. Possibly crucified upside down. What happened to Paul? Wait, I heard something over here. He was beheaded in Rome at about the same time as Peter under the Neronian persecution. Okay. Who'd we talk about next? James the Just. Who's James the Just? Brother of Jesus. How did James the Just die? He was thrown off a high place in the temple. He was thrown off a high place in the temple and stoned and then possibly beat over the head with a fuller's club. Right? Remember? Talked about that. That's James the Just. Then we talked about Boanerges. Who's Boanerges? The sons of thunder. James and John, sons of Zebedee. And how did they die? We know that James was killed by, was it Agrippa or Herod? One of them chopped his head off first thing in Acts there, and then John died of old age, right? And that brings us to Thomas, where we are tonight. Got it? You guys ready? Hey, you guys ready? Okay, come on. You want me to close this in prayer? Or? Okay. That's right. and especially, etc. Oh, did they? Oh, man, that used to be the best part. Oh, man. No more, etc. Hey. See you. Hey. It is believed that Matthew was also the son of Alphaeus, probably James, the son of Alphaeus' brother. Remember you read that, Matthew, son of Alphaeus. It is believed that it's quite possible he was James' brother. No, James, son of Alphaeus.